This is Books for Breakfast, a podcast where we talk about books and writing. I'm Enda Wiley.
And I'm Peter Sayre.
And you're all very welcome to this morning's show.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's episode. A very busy episode. It seems like only the blink of an eye since we had Adam Wyatt sitting at this table talking about 9 new collections of poems. But that wasn't enough, so we're back again with 5 more, this time reviewed by poet Ciarán O'Rourke. He'll be looking at new collections from Daedalus and Gallery, including Elaine Ní Chuilleánán's selected poems, Catherine Ann Cullen's Storm Damage, Keith Payne, Savage Acres, Patrick Cotter's Quality Control at the Miracle Factory, and Kevin Graham's Times Guest from Gallery. We'll also be talking to Mark Granier about his new collection from Salmon, Everything You Always Wanted to Know. So pour a big cup of coffee, a big mug of coffee, have at the scrambled eggs, and sit back and listen. This morning we welcome poet and critic Ciarán O'Rourke to our breakfast table here in Dublin 8. Ciarán has published 2 collections of poems with Irish Pages Press, The Buried Breath, which came out in 2018, and Phantom Gang in 2022. And he also runs the poetry website ragpickerpoetry.net. Ciarán, you've got 5 books of poetry that you're going to be talking about. And you're going to start with Elaine Ní Chuilleánán, who's featured on this podcast before with her collected poems. Do you remember when that came out in the middle of COVID?
It was in 2020, and it was really brilliant. I remember we went to Molly and we recorded Elaine. That was exciting. Nobody on the streets. And it's so strange. Actually, thinking of that, it's great to say as well that our podcast is actually 5 years old, isn't it?
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
That was her collected poems, and that was published in 2020. So that was a kind of a milestone collection. And now this, which is a second selected poems, would you say that's another milestone, Ciarán?
Absolutely, Peter, I agree. And before I jump in, can I just say it's really lovely to be here with both of you this morning. I've been a long time admirer and fan of the podcast, so it's nice to be joining you today. So as you mentioned, this is the most recent in a series of milestone publications. I think the term is absolutely correct. Honouring Elaine Ní Chuilleánán and her work. So a collected poems came out in 2020. There was a new standalone collection called The Map of the World in 2023. The Gallery Press brought out an anthology of tributes from other writers to mark her 80th birthday, and there's also, as you said, a previous selected poems that was co-published with Faber and Faber in London, and in many ways this is all great to see. I think she's arguably one of the outstanding Irish poets of our time and perhaps of all time. Speaking personally, and maybe this is a strange thing to say, but I often find that her poetry has almost a religious atmosphere to it, which is quite unusual. So, for example, rather than offering a straightforward evocation of a particular place or person, each poem feels more like a parable or a fable. Her revelations, if you like, arrive obliquely with a sort of slow illumination that makes you immediately want to reread what she's written.
Yeah, that is so true, because I'm thinking of poems like The Fireman's Lift, or the poem which is very much a story actually of the sister out in the field and she's doing the hay. Do you remember that poem? And then she goes up to the house and her other sister says, I'm not going to America. And so her sister takes her place. So it is kind of a fable or a story. I love the stories in Elaine. And like oblique seems like a very good word, Ciarán. She's quite an indirect poet, isn't she? And you really have to tune into her frequency, I think.
I think so, absolutely. And I love that poem that you mentioned. I think it's called She Was at the Haymaking.
That's exactly it. Or is it Haymaking? Yeah. Oh, Elaine will probably give out to us now for not remembering it exactly. But we remember the poem, and it's really strikes you, doesn't it? Yeah. And you go back and read it again and again, yeah.
It's almost like a short story by John McGahern, except even more distilled, which is quite an achievement.
Yeah.
But what you were saying there, I agree. And I sometimes think that with many contemporary poets, if you listen carefully, you can almost tell who's been reading Philip Larkin, say, or Adrian Rich, or Ted Hughes, or whoever it may be. But with Elaine Ní Chuilleánán, her voice on the page has a tone and a rhythm and a kind of inner architectural certainty that always seems unmistakably her own. There's a kind of dreaming clarity to her style, which can have a hypnotic effect and sometimes a haunting effect.
Yeah, and also...
Yeah, no, I'm just very. That's a very interesting way of putting it. That kind of inner architectural certainty. What do you mean by that, Ciarán?
I suppose I'm partly thinking of a poem of hers called The Architectural Metaphor, and I often think she seems to be always writing about kind of light as it strikes a particular building or a particular bridge or
a painting.
Or painting. So maybe I'm just in a very literalistic way taking the architecture that she brings into her poetry as a metaphor for her poetry.
Also, yeah, I think that's very true. But you also talk about, because I think what you say there about her voice on the page having a rhythm and a tone, but the voice is very distinctive, isn't it? It's not. She doesn't sound like other Irish poets.
Absolutely, yeah. I think very understandably sometimes. The Seamus Heaney mode, for example, ends up being imitated or kind of adapted by different kind of maybe younger generation poets to their own ends, and that's interesting in itself. Whereas with Elaine Quinlan, you feel that she's ploughing her own field and in her own direction, if you like. She's not operating on anyone else's terms.
Kind of a hard poet to imitate, I think.
I would say so, yeah. I can't really think of anyone who's comparable to her.
I love her. I like the fact as well that she is European, it seems to me. She loves Italy, and a lot of her poems, like the Morandi Bridge, are set in Italy, and yet they are, as you said, distinctively her, and she brings her own personal narrative into it as well. And sometimes actually you don't have to understand completely what Elaine's poems mean, because there's a mystery there, and I love that mystery. But in the Morandi Bridge there is the sadness of the death of her husband MacDara Woods as well, which comes into it, and I think that really makes it such a powerfully emotional poem as well, which pays tribute to the bridge and the collapse of it and the people who died there as well.
It's like she's making all these different connections all the time, but like very often, because story, you talked about kind of like story or fable, whatever, but there's a lot of, it's like it's a buried narrative under the poems. It's like a buried story, or it's a story that if you talk to Elaine about how that came about, and she'll say, oh, that happened, it was this person, we're thinking about this incident, this person. There's a very clear story in her own mind as she's writing it, but that's somehow kind of, we mentioned the word oblique, it's kind of disappears and it becomes slightly hidden in the actual poem.
But isn't it a case as well that she trusts, I think, in the imagination of the reader as well, and that we can imagine what it is about? And in a way, a poem, is there really a truth to a poem? You can make your own truths out of poems, can't you? I mean, who is it for anyone to say what a poem is really about? And we can make that decision ourselves as readers, can't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just an interesting way of thinking of it. But Ciarán, we'd love to hear you read a poem. I think you want to read a poem called The Notebooks, isn't that right?
Absolutely, yeah. So the book ends with 8 or 9 previously unpublished poems, and this is one of them. The Notebooks. The fire is slow to catch. I have learned to wait, checking the damp logs, turning away to the view of cliffs and sheep framed in rough stone, the narrow road, where just this moment the red, approaching van I saw 2 minutes ago, beginning the descent, speeds past with a half salute. No more distractions hover, no pages to tempt me away from the notebooks. Hungry for print, I recall with envy of the pleasing despair in a great library where at once you know you'll never reach the end of its high alcoves, walled with bound proceedings, although in every 5th or 6th there will be signs of occupancy, a pencil or a brush, and sometimes a naggin of strong, clear liquor, which has been opened just an inch gone.
Oh, Ciarán, thank you for reading that. And actually, I remember quite recently enough, actually, hearing Elaine read that poem. And what it was she went down, again, we were talking earlier about the stories within her poems. She had gone down to Kilreelig Artist Retreat, and she went with all her notebooks and she was bursting to write. And then she realised that, oh, maybe I'm getting this wrong, but that the poems didn't necessarily come. And she'd all these notebooks. And just because you go to a place to write doesn't mean that the poem is going to come. But yet, the poem did come in that beautiful poem called The Notebooks. Yeah. And if Elaine's listening, she's probably going to say, no, you've got that completely wrong, Enda. But anyway, that's what I remember. Do you remember her reading that, Peter?
I do. I remember, and I'm trying to remember who I heard recently talking about notebooks and about how notebooks were bad for poetry because you needed to be there sitting in the space and writing, and that the act of writing the poem itself kind of released something, whereas the act of taking notes doesn't do that. And it's a weird thing. I know lots of poets take notes and kind of write things in for further But I know a lot of poets who would never take it out because it would spook them. I don't know how if that happens to you, Kieran. But
so that's brilliant that you chose that. And Kieran, will you talk a little bit about the final poems at the end, because they're new poems. Do you feel that she's on the verge of a new collection?
Well, I don't know that for a fact, but I did wonder, as there are kind of previously unpublished poems at the end of this volume, whether there might be another book in the works that might appear in the next year or two, maybe. You could ask the question in that case, if it is true, whether another selected poems or new selected poems is needed right now in the meantime. But that's just a quibble. I think, this volume as it stands is beautiful, but also valuable, I think, as a primer or introduction for new readers of Eleni Quillanon's poetry, but also as a reminder for long-standing followers of her work of its sheer range and achievement. She's an essential poet, as I said, and this selection does justice to her.
It's also a slimmer volume than the very vast collected, so it's an easier one to put in your bag as well and bring around and enjoy. And of course, there's a beautiful painting on the cover of her own mother by Edward Maguire, which was painted in 1976. So it's lovely to see that as well, and a beautiful production by Gallery. So we will move on now to from Gallery to Daedalus Press and to Catherine Ann Cullen's recent collection, Storm Damage. So can you tell us a little bit about Catherine Ann Cullen?
So Catherine Ann Cullen is a poet who has either won or been shortlisted for a number of well-known prizes here in Ireland, including the Moth Poetry Prize and the Strokestown Poetry Prize. She has a number of collections to her name. I think she was also previously a poet in residence at Poetry Ireland. So perhaps unsurprisingly, given all this experience on her part, there's a self-confidence and a real vividness to this new collection, Storm Damage. Somewhat reminiscent of Evan Boland, I think, and maybe Paula Meehan to some extent. Her approach to themes of memory and history, intimacy, and in her case, motherhood, feels tender and visceral at the same time. So she has a poem called Lullaby on Your 18th Birthday, which reads, "Night feeding, crooning under the covers, I felt the long reach back through mothers of mothers. You drank the shapes of words till you weaned yourself away." So as here, I think there's a subtle feminist sheen to much of Cullen's writing, but she's also something of an internationalist, if you like, in her outlook. So
yeah, I was going to say that she kind of that she is a poet of the domestic as well, but then that she likes to kind of go beyond that. She ranges kind of beyond that concern.
Absolutely, yeah. So this is a kind of world-encompassing collection, if you like. So the Magdalene Laundries appear, but there's also a poem for a Palestinian teenager who was killed in the West Bank, which I'm sure will resonate with lots of people. Somewhat relatedly, perhaps, Irish words and phrases are stitched into the fabric of her poems, which adds, I think, to their texture and musicality. And it may also be worth saying, just at that point, she can be very witty as well as lyrical. We expect poets to be lyrical, but she has one poem which offers a variation on Patrick Kavanagh's famous In Memory of My Father, and hers opens with the lines, "Every old bike I see reminds me of my rucker, saddle breasting a garden hedge or nuzzling the gutter." So there are moments of soft humour like that sprinkled throughout the book. Very occasionally, I think the poems perhaps slip into explaining the memories and epiphanies that they set out to describe, as if they want to make sure that the audience finds them just as meaningful as the poet clearly does. By and large, though, I think Catherine Ann Cullen is fluently and often powerfully her own poet, and this collection makes for immersive reading. I highly recommend it.
Well, thanks for that, Kieran. That's a great review for Catherine Ann Cullen's Storm Damage, just out from Daedalus Press. And actually, I just want to say as well how enjoyable it was to launch with Catherine Ann Cullen and Patrick Cotter, who we will be talking about later, up in the Teachers Club in Parnell Square. It was a great old launch, wasn't it, Peter?
It was a great occasion, very enjoyable.
Yeah, it was great that you came along as well, Kieran.
And here is Catherine Ann Cullen reading her poem, Fetishes.
I was treated for breast cancer last year, and this poem is about all of the ways that people give you their best wishes and bring you their little charms and amulets to wish you well. And that was very, very touching part of the experience. So this poem is called Fetishes. A whisper of silver slips into my palm from the silk pouch Justine proffers. Slowly his great wings come into focus, his raised sword, his foot on the head of his old friend. I notice the family of worry dolls ranged in order of size on the wobbly table by Stella's bed. Moira crochets a blanket in healing colours, greens, blues, violet. Laura brings me a felted sugar skull with embroidered flowers for eyes and 3 stitched teeth bared above a gold tassel. Our daughters manifest a breast of hammered tin from Santa Luciella in Naples. I finger its ridged frame, wrap it in the blanket for the hospital, tug it into my coat pocket for every appointment. There are so many appointments. Every so often, a glim fairy leaves a fresh candle by the front door. A traveller woman named Josie, who stops to take some of the clutter laid out in front of my parents' house, takes hold of my hand, then rummages in her car for a flask of holy water in the shape of Our Lady. I place it with the phial of shaman water, soothing citrus, rose and lavender that Justine brought last time. Today she is awkward. I wasn't sure you'd want this, a miraculous medal of Michael the Archangel. I hug her, tell her that these days I embrace all the ways of loving, grasp whatever anyone holds against the dark.
Okay, now we're going to move on to another Daedalus poet. Can you believe it? And his name is Keith Payne. And actually, Keith Payne has been on our podcast before. And Kieran's here to talk about his new book, Savage Acres. And Keith has done a lot of translation as well as original poetry. So we're going to move now to Savage Acres, his own collection of poems. What do you make of it, Kieran?
Yeah, so Keith Payne, as you said, and as you know, he divides his time between Ireland and northern Spain, Galicia, which I'm probably mispronouncing, and apologies if so. And as you said, Savage Acres is his most recent poetry collection. So it revisits Payne's the housing estates in Tala where Payne grew up, and he composes a sort of love letter to them and to his former neighbours, which also feels like a temperature check for the state of the nation today. So in Payne's words, Ireland, or if you like, the wider Dublin area, is a place where every fall of rain is a home from home. And in many ways, this collection might be thought of as a meditation on the meaning of home, what it means to build or to belong, to make a life in a particular place, and in some cases, to try your best to survive that place. So in one poem called We Made a Fist of It, he writes, "Nobody said it would be easy, wringing water from a towel or rendering a breach in the wall with the deft flick of a trowel. Your knuckles catch on the pebble dash, which blooms gentian violet."
He's a poet who writes a lot about materials as well and buildings, doesn't he? And the heft and the make of them. Yeah, because we saw him actually down in Bear Island last year doing a brilliant performance actually of the building of a boat. So he loves to perform his work as well. So I think when you were just reading his poem there, but when you actually see him perform as well, that's something else. It's quite powerful, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there's a real political edge to this collection, actually. So given the reverberating effects of Dublin's ongoing housing crisis, unfortunately, I imagine it will touch a chord with many readers. But it's also a deeply personal and affecting tribute on Keith Payne's part to the people he knew in his younger years. He mixes sadness and celebration as he paints a kind of panoramic portrait of his community and his tribe in all their vibrancy and vulnerability. So maybe that relates to the kind of performance aspect that you were picking up on in his work. There's a very striking cover photo for this collection, and there's a poem included which accompanies it called Children of the Reservation Part 1, in which Payne writes, "Of Martha, Queen of the Green, black crow feathers hung from black plaits, stands blanket wrapped, her face painted for war or dance." I should say I really loved this collection. I found it wild and bright and truthful in all the best ways, and so I hope it reaches a wide audience of readers.
That's brilliant, Kieran. Thank you. I'm sure Keith will be delighted with that. And also listening to you there is very interesting because I spent many years teaching down in Sean McDermott Street, and of course Paula Meehan was the bard of Gardner Street and all around there, and she had her tribe and her community. So it's great to see Keith Payne, a younger poet, coming from the tribe of Tala, and reflecting the community and the life they're growing up. So it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, he's carrying on the torch.
He's carrying on the community torch, that's right. So next up now, we're moving from Tala and that tribe down to the city of Cork and to Patrick Cotter. Patrick Cotter has been director of the Munster Literature Centre for many years, but he's also a poet. And Quality Control at the Miracle Factory, what a title, is his fourth collection from Daedalus. So, Ciarán, what is going on in the Miracle Factory?
So, as you said, it has a very memorable title, Quality Control at the Miracle Factory. The first thing to say, I think, about Patrick Cotter, and this reminded me a little bit of the novels and short stories of Kevin Barry, if you've read him. I'm sure you're familiar with him. You may even be friends with him. But there's a kind of density to his descriptions and sometimes an exuberance, a gothic exuberance to the way that they unfold, which can be disturbing as well as very gripping. So he has a poem here called The Child Being Raised by Owls, which sort of does what it says on the tin, if you like. But he writes of the title character that she coos in the minor keys of melancholy. She'll grow until the bough fractures or until all legendary wisdom pecks its way out of her skull. In other ways, Cotter comes across as a remarkably observant and grounded poet. He offers us glimpses of the manifold ways in which our society continues to fail people in various ways. So he has one very moving poem dedicated to a lady, a rough sleeper who died in Cork, in which he writes, "Small comfort now to you, the fires of cremation are tepid tears as the flesh drifts off your bones like smoke when all along your skin deserved to be lit by pearls, unctioned by L'Oreal and Chanel."
I just find it interesting what you're saying about the kind of Gothic, because you get that kind of sense of the Gothic imagination in those lines, I think. But there's also a fair bit about war in this collection, isn't there?
Yeah, so an entire section of the book actually sets out to chronicle the effects of military violence and violation in a range of arenas, including Ukraine and Gaza. He also turns his attention at one point to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so with a hint of what might be described as calm irony, he says, "In place of a machine gun tripod, I plant an artist's easel targeting the same ground," which implicitly raises questions, I think, about the ethics of artistic witness and artistic agency in a time of live-streamed atrocity. And in a similar vein, another section of the book examines the lives and fates of various animals living in a human world that has a talent, unfortunately, for turning other creatures into meat or clothing or even symbols of human needs and desires. So Cotter has an original slant on this universe we're living in. At times, and again, it's just a small remark really, but the ornate and tangled quality of Cotter's descriptions can be a little bit difficult to navigate, and perhaps the poems get a bit bogged down by their own fixations, but that's true of all of us, I'm sure, myself included. The main point, I think, is that there's a real imaginative intensity and vitality to Cotter's style, and this is a very engaging collection, well worth reading, and as you said, Enda, it's available from the Daedalus Press.
Yeah, and I do agree that, poetry sometimes isn't easy. And it's good to, I think, sometimes be challenged by a poet like Patrick Cotter. And if the language, as you said, sometimes seems tangled, I enjoy that actually. It's like going into a forest of words and untangling the meaning. And as you said, there is an imaginative, vital force there. So I definitely think this is a really interesting collection. And also, you were speaking earlier of Kevin Barry, and I was thinking of a prose writer like Mary Costello, who in her collection also wrote about animals and that the way they were, have been so mistreated in society. So I think it's a very interesting theme, and I really enjoyed that, And sometimes I like that kind of conversation of reading that you get. You're reading one book and it connects with another. But no, Patrick Cotter's book is a strong collection. And as I said earlier, it was great to launch with him and also with Catherine Ann Cullen earlier this month in the Teachers' Centre.
And we actually have Patrick Cotter reading from this collection now.
From the state of the blessed dead. If grief is a thing with feathers, still it lacks flight. The feathers, like petrified leaves of a petrified forest, weighty as a trunk. When I told them to shorten your suffering, I never meant they should starve and dehydrate you to death. You rejected the wet sponge in your mouth, twisted into a rictus while still alive, with eye whites yellowing. The fentanyl drip in the main pumping to keep you quiet and manageable. As you worsened, "Oh, you can see the difference now," said the middle-class lady doctors, as proud as of any cake their mothers might have baked, rising in the oven. I realized they had never watched somebody die minute by minute, all day, all week long, in and out in a jiffy. They just glimpsed a soul wisping away. We live in the state of the blessed dead, a polity where a miracle to be hoped for is nothing as grandiose as resurrection, but a simple good death, instead of a realm where the dying shrivel without grace, where the grieving dread their future. Serenity in such a setting is a worse kind of derangement than despair. There is no dignity to a slow death, and only a little to slow grief. Am I real or what? Your response to my "what are you thinking?" This weeks before, when you still had speech, a personality before the blast of radium, Dryden's heap of jarring atoms, wrenched words away from you, and grunting came on, sounding like a combustion engine turning over in a public ward where men's screams were tectonic enough to loosen dust between floorboards. "You're real," said I, "a fabulist, who believes a realist is one who conspires to preserve delusions cherished by the masses. In this moment my mind has travelled from a future where I can no longer be here, a future where I wish I could still press the warm flesh of you, smell the unwashed scent of you, listen to your voice which I heard sing only once in my distant childhood in a house you thought was empty but for you, a house you thought never listened to your song. I can't remember your one song, only to never forget it was something upbeat, something learned from Ella or Frank or the Andrews sisters, not Holidays, Loverman, Where Have You Gone? Listened by you one day over and over in a melancholy funk, a mystery funk, your wife, my mother, in the next room.
And so now from Patrick Cotter and Cork to another gallery poet, Kevin Graham, whose first collection, The Lookout Post, was published in 2023. And he's back, I have to say, pretty quickly with his second Times guest. 2 years doesn't seem like a long time between collections, does it, Ciarán?
Oh, I fully agree. Yeah, he's one to watch. He may be a new arrival on the scene, but he's definitely going places. So, as you said, when The Lookout Post, his first collection, came out in 2023, it garnered a good deal of critical praise and attention, and it's not hard to see why in this collection either. You know, he's a skilled, graceful writer. His poems, I think, managed to be elegantly crafted, but without seeming in any way contrived or overly workshopped, which is sometimes a risk. They really do brim with emotion to the extent that every other poem he writes sounds like a love poem, even if his subject happens to be nature or music or art or whatever else it may be. I'm not sure if this is a word in the Oxford English Dictionary, but there's a Heaney-esque quality at times to the way that he refreshes our sense of the mystery and the richness of everyday experiences and everyday memories. So in one poem called Babes in the Wood, just walking through a local park, he writes, "Rain turns the white noise up, trembling through gaps into a clearing I've missed, to brace like a river getting deeper by the minute, to sparkle in this slick domain. Let's patter with our brollies through elderflower, past toothwort and bird cherry into emerald, where thought goes to lie down."
Oh, that's beautiful. Let's patter with our brollies through elderflower. That's gorgeous, isn't it?
Yeah, but I like the rain turning the white noise up as well.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
Because Peter, recently, weren't you writing a poem about noise as well? in this world.
Was I?
Yes, you were, Peter, sir. It's all being revealed.
We won't go into that.
It's all being revealed here now.
Okay. I know, because it's something that you're very interested in, Kieran, and we've talked about this before, and it's that the link between poetry and politics, and if you like, the idea that poets should be engaged and they shouldn't stand aloof from the political world or the issues of the day. And I wonder, does Kevin Graham engage with contemporary Ireland as well?
He does, absolutely. You know, I find it inspiring in a way that poetry, as well as being lyrical and evocative, can also be a mode or an instrument of critique, if you like, but it doesn't have to be. And sometimes, as you were hinting at there, I think the literary market, if you like, does want poets to be kind of demonstrably conscientious as well as eloquent, if you like. So we're expected to demonstrate some kind of political awareness in the poems that we produce. And there are moments in this collection when Graham tries to meet that expectation, if you like. So he includes poems addressing the rise of far-right politics in Ireland, including about the Dublin riots of 2023. And to be completely honest, I wasn't fully won over by those efforts. I think Graham is most comfortable, but also most captivating as a poet when he's writing from his own sources, which to me seem to revolve more around love and memory, family and nature, and also, as the title suggests, the sensation of time as it passes. And when Graham cleaves to those themes, there's no one else exactly like him. He is a shining lyrical poet whose music rings true. And so, as I said, he's one to watch, and I think this book definitely deserves to be read and to be celebrated.
And we'll hear him reading from that now.
Weather. If there'd been tension or disagreement over a bill, you couldn't tell. In an instant, the whole restaurant fell silent, as if a spell had been cast. Each heart in the room was a bellwether, feather light and mysterious. Snow sank through the imperious night over candles floating behind the glass like a Hollywood movie. Inside, sudden, mass beauty, we bonded naturally and watched like children the heavens open, the clock stop. Each flake seemed to carry something that couldn't be expressed. And so we clung to the flurry passing, the wideness of the world gifting what couldn't be possessed.
But just before we let you go, Kieran, because I'm just intrigued by that discussion, if you like, because you say there's an expectation that poets should be engaged in political, and yet it's a hard thing to do, and you know, current events pass, and you know, topicality kind of passes, and how engaged. What does a poet need to do to kind of, you know, if you're engaged with Gaza, the Ukraine, the far right in Ireland, how do you manage to do that without it seeming passé in a couple of years or fake in some way? I don't know.
Or forced. It can sometimes feel very forced. I mean, I'm thinking of Brodsky, who said the only thing that poetry and politics have in common is the P and the O. But it's interesting what Kieran said there, that actually when Kevin Graham enters the world of his own personal authentic truths, which is his family, his memories, his feelings, that it rings true. So, not that we're saying, of course, that he's responding in any forced way to political events, but it can be tricky, Peter, I think, can't it, to respond?
So now Kieran has to answer all those questions.
Yeah, it's very tough for you, Kieran.
Well, I think Adrienne Rich, the American poet, when she was asked about more or less this issue, about the fact that she was perceived as a very politically engaged poet, if you like, she just said very simply that I write from absolute inner necessity, but it's just her inner necessities happen to include or encompass what might be termed political or social aspects of our shared life together in society. So I think that's what makes her poetry authentic, if you like. But as you say, you know, the worst thing you can do is force it or fake it.
I think so. If you think of Anna Akhmatova as well, I mean, she was there writing the greatest love poems during a time of huge political upheaval, Osip Mandelstam being taken away to the camps, Anna Akhmatova, you know, writing these beautiful love poems.
I think Paula Meehan once said that the most stirring political poem could be a love lyric between two people. So maybe that's what she had in mind.
And again, it comes back to that great phrase, the inner necessity.
Yeah, that's right.
Because if you're putting it on, then it shows straight away.
Yeah, I love a quote which I've been quoting a lot recently from Mary Oliver. She says, "Pay attention, be astonished, celebrate it." And in a way, that's what you're doing as a poet. You're paying attention. So if poets are paying attention in a way which is true and authentic, then it's going to work, isn't it, Peter?
I think so, and I think probably these poets that we've talked about today are clearly poets who pay attention. I think we can probably agree on that.
Absolutely, I think that's the perfect phrase. Yeah.
Really, thanks so much to Kieran O'Rourke, because he's surrounded by a pile of books here and he read through them and he thoroughly, obviously, enjoyed them, and we've so enjoyed listening to you today. And as usual, details of all these books will be available on booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com.
Mark Granier is an award-winning Irish poet and photographer whose work has been widely published and admired for its sharp imagery, lyric precision and subtle wit. Over the past 2 decades, he's brought out several acclaimed collections, including Airborne, Haunt, Fade Street, as well as Ghostlight, new and selected poems. His latest book, Everything You Always Wanted to Know, is perhaps his most personal and revealing to date, weaving together memory, intimacy, and the everyday with a striking visual clarity.
Alongside his poetry, Granier is also an accomplished photographer. Indeed, his photographs have graced the covers of not one, but 2 of my own collections of poetry. And the interplay between word and image has become a distinctive hallmark of his creative practice. Well, today we'll be talking to Mark Granier about his new collection, Everything You Always Wanted to Know, how it fits within his wider body of work, and the ways poetry, and amongst other things, the way photography shapes his vision of the world. Well, Mark, I heard the title poem being read by you at a poetry reading long before it appeared in this book, and I immediately loved it for its humour, that first line. And I'd love to hear you read it, Mark, and maybe if you could just read it, as we don't want to give away too much, and we can talk about it afterwards, okay?
Everything You Always Wanted to Know. At 15, I found Burt Reynolds in my mother's bed, stowed under her pillow in a Cosmo centerfold, impossibly hairy, recumbent on a bearskin rug, a chewed cigarillo between his lips. He was grinning, happy to be discovered, even as I slid him back where I'd found him, like the miraculous medal she'd hidden under my mattress, like the legion of things that can never be spoken and what would remain unsaid, about the convent girl who'd strayed enough to give birth to 2 children, how she found ways to widen a single bed and kick her cold Catholic hot water bottle onto the floor.
I love that last line, the Catholic hot water bottle on the floor. But I remember that wherever I saw it, I remember that Burt Reynolds image very well. Hairy Burt Reynolds kind of inviting the camera into his space. Don't know where I could have saw it. Anyway, it's a very witty poem, Mark. It's also deeply personal, deeply serious too. And it's as much about what is said and not said about your mother. And I wondered, could you speak a little bit about her life, which is hinted at in the line about her straying and giving birth to 2 children, which also relates to the great absence in your own life and poetry of your father, whom you never knew.
That's true, Peter. My mother was part of a large Catholic family of 7 children, but she was the only one who had 2, let alone 2 kids out of wedlock. It happened because she was working in a Canadian Army base in the 1950s, and she met my father in 1956. And I think she had a short relationship with him, though it was very painful for her to talk about it. And actually, it wasn't until until I was 17 that I actually discovered that I was born out of wedlock. And there was a bit of a thrill in that, when I was 17, I had long hair and was quite attracted to the idea of kind of subversive possibilities. So it was kind of a bit of a thrill to discover I was an actual bastard. But my mother had another child before me, and she didn't tell me about him, Michael, until I was in my 30s. And that's when I discovered I actually had a brother by my mother. I have to, it makes my mother sound like quite a repressed and secretive person, but actually she wasn't like that at all. She was quite an open and flamboyant person in many ways. And, I thought it was a shame that she didn't actually meet up with anybody else, but she ended up taking care of her parents. Her parents took her in. They had the first child adopted. I was the second child, and she ended up living with her parents and taking care of them as they grew older. And so that was the household I grew up in, which is very much grandfather's household. It smelt of cigars, and then you had grandmother, who was quite shy, and she wasn't very demonstrative with grandfather or anybody else. And so it was, it's kind of a strange, it wasn't strange to me, but to friends who visited me, it was quite an odd household. It wasn't like your typical middle-class Irish Catholic household, although we did say grace at meals and stuff like that. But it was dominated by the presence of grandfather, I think. And yeah, that's what my mother ended up doing. And then
there's a photograph, isn't there?
There is one photograph, yeah, of my father and my mother in the Canteen Club, it was called, which I think was probably typical of army bases. They had a place where they'd meet and mingle. And it was a striking photo. She didn't give me that photo until I think I was 17, when she told me, up until then, and this will give you an idea of just how dreamy a household I grew up in. Until then, I thought, I had a vague sense that my father had been killed in a war. I mean, what war would that have been? It didn't really make any sense. And then when my mother told me, she gave me this photograph, and he's in uniform sitting with her. They're both smoking cigarettes, sitting at a table, and evidently surprised, but quite relaxed looking by the photographer, just taking this snap. So, yeah.
It's interesting, Mark, because I've seen that photograph, and it's incredible. It must have been incredible for you to see it as well. And as you said, they look so relaxed in it, but you never found your father. You never, your mother, she didn't really help in that way. Sure, she didn't, about searching for him.
To be fair to my mother, when she eventually told me, she was helpful, but I actually didn't begin to search for my father. I mean, I have a website, fatherfinder.com, a blog rather, in which I got some replies from people, in the army and Canadian Army. Some people were very helpful, but you know what? I mean, it's partly my own laziness. I haven't really, what I probably need to do is put that photograph into a local Canadian papers somewhere in Canada and see if anything comes back. But I haven't, I went as far as putting together the blog, and my mother was helpful. She really did try to help. But I think at that stage, because this was in her later years, it was difficult. It was painful for her to talk about. I think there was that Catholic sense of shame that she was always trying to get over, but she was very loving, a very warm person. And she did try to help me, but it was difficult.
Yeah, I know.
And she couldn't remember that many details, at that stage.
Yeah. Well, many of the poems talking about the past and memory, many of the poems in this book, Everything You Always Wanted to Know, are the backward glance, aren't they? They're poems of memory. You're going back in time. You're seeing your past in a really vivid way. In Tormelino's 1972, you're 15 years old. You're being casually complimented by a man twice your age. That poem becomes kind of a terrifying narrative of near abuse. In Pinball Wizard, you're on top of the world, prizing loose big wedges of scree to watch them wobble like liberated wheels down a hill in West Cork. I love the freedom in that poem. And in Dublin, 5:32 p.m, May the 17th, 1974. And the time is really important because you're recalling the third Dublin bombing near Green's Bookshop that day. Your cousin Pat McAllister was close by and luckily he wasn't hurt. So really all these poems, they're vivid, they're striking, they're imaginative, they're varied, they're delving back into time. And Mark, the power of memory matters to you as a poet in this book. But the poems are also, I thought, great stories. So you're kind of Mark, the poet storyteller. But of course, there is a difference between stories and poetry. But there's such great stories in these poems.
I'm glad you think so. And narratives and stories and my past. I've plundered my past. And I'm hoping, actually, in my next collection, perhaps not to be quite so in the past. But yeah, there are stories. There are the one that you mentioned, by the way, about Torremolinos. That was extraordinary, an extraordinary event, because I don't know if I was ever more terrified to actually find myself in a strange man's apartment and to suddenly realize that, Christ, what am I doing here? And why has he brought me here? I was ridiculously naive. I mean, I was 15, but I was more like 10.
Peter, you wanted to ask Mark about him being a photographer, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. Obviously, Mark, you're a photographer as well as a poet. I've seen many of your photographs over the years, and I just wondered, do you think there's common ground between capturing an image with a lens and making a poem on the page?
Yeah, I think there's a crossroads where poetry and photography meet. John Berger, one of my favorite quotes is from John Berger. He said, photographs are quotations from appearances. And paintings, therefore, are translations, which is a different thing. So that idea, I've always been attracted to concision in poetry. I like being able to work in really short forms, and photography, I suppose, is part of that concern, that interest or obsession I have. And it's probably been with me for quite a while. I was when I was in my teens, I discovered American photographers like Robert Frank, who photographed seemingly incidental sort of occurrences, like looking out over wet roofs in some motel somewhere, or photographing a couple that looks slightly unhappy, uncomfortable, dancing in some dingy dance hall somewhere in America, or these great sort of road photos that he took. And that really interested me. And then I got hold of an SLR, single lens reflex camera, proper camera, in other words, when I was working in Captain America's, when I was about 19. And I discovered that I felt I understood the language of photography. In the same way that hopefully I understand the language of poetry. And I suppose, I've always been interested in images particularly. I mean, there are an array of available different devices in poetry, obviously. But the image has always been really interesting to me. I think it was Heaney who mentioned that anecdote about Wordsworth. He used to compose out loud when he was wandering around the Lake District. And apparently he had a dog with him that he would send ahead of him, and the dog would alert him if there was somebody approaching, because, he might be considered mad and locked up somewhere for talking to himself, Anyway.
I think we need to train Oscar to do that.
Yes.
That's a good idea. Train our dog, who's your voice is obviously having a very soporific effect on our dog today, because he's sleeping quietly on the sofa listening to you talk about Wordsworth and highfalutin things like that, Mark. But listen, we'd love to hear a poem, wouldn't we, Peter?
Yeah, indeed. And speaking of photography, the poem Eyes begins images, and it becomes a meditation on eyes, as well as a memory of the very first woman that you lived with. And I know how much you like cats too, Mark, and a black one comes into this poem. So, yeah, we'd love to hear that one.
Okay, I'll read Eyes. I have it here. Eyes. Images. Images. We have always praised that part of our flesh that sees baby blue, sparkling, sultry, clear, or eyes as unremarkable as mine, a murky, greenish brown. I can see now the gold eyes of the black cat. She adopted in 82, but not hers, the first woman I lived with. It's her lovely, open face I won't forget. The expressionist mask in which our glance is set is what we are often speaking of when we say that someone's eyes shine. Though it might be hands that define a nimble and knowledgeable warmth. Close your eyes. No need to probe this dark to find a membrane, for a soul to lean out and tell us what we know we're at, trailing through each other like rain.
Oh, Mark, what a great last line. I found that poem, I have to say, very surprising. Mm-hmm. When the cat enters it, it's as if the poem suddenly slinks off in a different direction with the cat, which I didn't at all expect. So do poems surprise you where they take you to? Like writing a poem like this, did you know where you were headed?
Yeah, no, not really. I did come up with the last line, as sometimes happens, before I completed the poem. I can't remember how many drafts that went through, but yeah, the black cat came. It wandered into the poem as cats tend to do occasionally. There's a lovely poem actually by Tony Hogland in which he talks about a cat wandering out of the shadows at night. He suddenly sees it and he says to the cat, "You're the king of the night," which is a lovely line. But
like in a way, it's interesting you brought him into the equation there, because reading is so important, isn't it? Because the cat comes into your poem and then that reminds you of Hogland. And in a way, you had the final line, but do you think you're kind of always working towards that if you have that final line?
I don't know. It comes in different ways. I mean, there are poems that, like the last poem in the collection, Road. I don't know how many drafts that went through, and it's quite a simple and straightforward poem. You know, but it uses anaphora, the repetition of the road as in each line, but. It's different. You know, some poems do come really simply and organically, but other poems, take a lot of work, and I can't really tell how quickly it'll happen, Yeah, you kind of know when you've got something though,
I know, it's a strange business, isn't it? Yeah, especially if you hear the rhythm of that beautiful line about the rain. I could see why it gets you into a rhythm and a beat and off the poem. And the poem can take you, as I said, in places you didn't expect.
Yeah, rain is a thing though, isn't it? I'm a bit wary of it because it's been used so much. I remember Conor O'Callaghan had a book called The History of Rain. And numerous poets have talked about rain, including actually Tony Hogland, come to think of it. But I suppose these are just things that, they're like elemental things that draw you back. There's no point in trying to escape. You just have to write about them. Rain, stars,
Cats.
Yeah, cats, exactly, yeah.
Cats as well.
The poet Mark Roper praises your new collection, and he says, starting on a pavement and ending on a road, Mark Granier's welcome new collection stays on its feet as it celebrates the strange and sometimes terrifying miracle of being alive. Which is a wonderful description of everything you always wanted to know. So congratulations, Mark, on this fine new collection published by Salmon. And I think maybe we might head to sunny San Francisco now. And maybe you might read us out with your final choice of poem, which is set there. So maybe you could lead us into Accosted, which starts there on the west coast of America.
Sure. This was one of those poems, again, that took me quite a while to write because it was about twice as long at first. And I was trying to fit in all kinds of biographical details. And then it just came to me. I think it was it was Raymond Carver's poem, Happiness, which I think was a little kind of prompt that the poem could be more directly about that sensation, because I did have that line in it, about walking on the sunny side of a street. But yeah, I eventually I realized that I could just basically edit the poem and chop it in half, So yeah, it's about a period in San Francisco in '82 when it was the first time I lived with a woman, and there was a sense of just having landed in it was beautiful. The place where I lived, Cole Street, was extraordinary. I didn't know it at the time, but Tom Gunn lived on the same street, I was kind of continually surprised to find myself in this wonderful little segment of San Francisco where we lived, with all its coffee shops and bookshops. It was like a little village. Anyway, so the poem is called Accosted. I'm 25, walking on the sunny side of a street in San Francisco, probably Church or Cole, when I am visited by an awareness keen as a warmth on my face and arms. As if things have finally slipped into place, my life clothed in a new skin, bright as the absurdly yellow Victorian house or bedroom with the bay window. Though nothing's in place, I'm coasting. My girlfriend, already tired of my indolent dreaminess. Happiness. It clasps your arm, stops you in the street, then lets you go.
But Mark, thank you so much. That was Mark Granier. His book, Everything You Always Wanted to Know, go out and get it. Published by Salmon, and also Kathleen Jamie's Cairn. And all details of all these books will be available as usual on www.buzzsprout.com. Actually, Books for Breakfast. www.booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. Mark Granier, thank you so much.
Thanks a million. That was wonderful.
I think we've reached the end of our Books for Breakfast podcast this morning. I'm definitely rushing off to have more coffee. And I'm Enda Wiley, and I have Peter Sarah here with me. And Peter, would you like to tell everyone about the details of the podcast if they'd like to listen again?
Well, you can subscribe at all the usual sources, Apple, Spotify, Pocket Casts, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to check out the notes that go along with this podcast, you can go to booksforbreakfastireland.buzzsprout.com. So
we'll be back again next Thursday morning. We'll have the toast on, we'll have the kettle boiling, we will have more books to discuss, and we're looking forward to having you here. So goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.